So, picture this. World War II is over, but instead of peace, a deep shadow starts to fall across Europe. Two incredibly powerful military alliances are about to rise up, turning the entire continent into a fortress and kicking off an era of insane global tension. Today, we're digging into the story of NATO versus the Warsaw Pact.
And really, it all kicks off with this famous phrase from Winston Churchill. After the war, Europe was completely fractured, and this Iron Curtain he talked about, well, it wasn't a real wall, not yet anyway. It was a powerful symbol of the massive ideological divide between the communist East and the capitalist West.
So that's the big question, right? How does a figure of speech, a metaphor, turn into a hard physical reality? A border lined with armies, tanks, and scariest of all, nuclear weapons. Well, the answer is all about the creation of two rival military alliances. All right, so let's start with the West's perspective. After the war, they looked at their old ally, the Soviet Union, and didn't see a friend anymore. They saw a growing expansionist threat. And they felt like they had to do something to organize some kind of collective defense before it was too late.
And the real trigger, the moment that lit the fuse, that was the Berlin blockade in 1948, when the Soviets just cut off all road and rail access to West Berlin. It was a massive shock. For the Western powers, this was all the proof they needed that the USSR was serious about its aggressive goals in Europe.
So the West didn't wait around. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, you know it as NATO, was born. And let's be clear, this was not just some political handshake. This was a full-blown military alliance, a nuclear defense pact with one crystal-clear mission: to stand up to the Soviet threat. No, the absolute core of NATO, the thing that makes it tick, is Article 5. And it's simple. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all of them. The message to the Soviets couldn't have been clearer. But the unofficial motto was even more blunt, and it perfectly captured their thinking. Keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and Germany down.
But of course, this wasn't a one-sided affair. The creation of NATO sent huge shockwaves to the Soviet Union and its satellite states. They look at this new Western alliance and saw a direct threat, a provocation that they felt they absolutely had to answer.
For a few years, the Soviets just watched as NATO got bigger and stronger. But there was one thing that was just a step too far. In 1955, their old enemy, West Germany, was allowed to rearm and officially join the NATO alliance. For Moscow, that was it. A line had been crossed.
And that's what led to this. Just 6 years after NATO was founded, boom, the Warsaw Pact is created. They called it a treaty of mutual assistance, but look at the timing. It was a direct, tit-for-tat response to a bigger, stronger NATO that now included a rearmed West Germany.
You can really just think of it as a communist NATO. That's the simplest way to put it. It basically copied its rival's whole collective defense structure, creating this massive military bloc that was completely under the command of the Soviet Union.
So when you put them side by side, it's pretty clear what's happening here. It's like a mirror image. NATO forms in 49 because they're afraid of the Soviets. Then the Warsaw Pact forms in 55 because West Germany joined NATO. What you end up with are two giant, hostile alliances staring each other down across a divided Europe. Okay, so the stage is set. We've got our two opposing teams. But what did that actually mean for the world? How did these two pacts turn Churchill's poetic curtain into a very real and very, very dangerous border?
And to really get the fallout here, we've got to put on our historian hats for a minute. We need to look past just the treaties themselves and really analyze the long-term consequences. How long this thing lasted, how wide it spread, and what it did to global politics.
First, let's talk timeline. This wasn't some short-lived crisis. This was the new normal, defining global politics for decades, right up until 1991. And the scope? It was absolutely international. The ripples were felt everywhere: America, Europe, Asia. But the biggest impact, it created this terrifying global stalemate where the whole world was held hostage by nuclear tension.
And you have to understand, for the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact wasn't just about defense. Oh, no. It was a tool of control. It gave them the excuse they needed to keep their troops all over Eastern Europe. And if any country tried to step out of line, like Hungary did in 1956, the pact was the hammer used to crush them and force them back into obedience.
Think about that. Nearly 50 years. That's almost half a century. An entire generation of people grew up knowing nothing else, but a world defined by these two opposing nuclear-armed alliances constantly on the brink of war.
So, what's the big picture here? When you boil it all down, what's the real legacy of this era? Well, it's all about how the conflict itself was transformed.
At the end of the day, this is what it all boils down to. NATO and the Warsaw Pact took what was a political or ideological rivalry and turned it into a formal, structured, militarized standoff. That Iron Curtain Churchill talked about, it was no longer just a phrase. It now had armies. The division of Europe was complete.
And that leaves us with a really tough question, one that's still so relevant today. Both of these alliances said they were for defense, for peace. But what they created was a world that lived on a knife's edge, constantly close to all-out war. It makes you wonder, are these giant military alliances really a path to security? Or do they just make conflicts bigger and a whole lot more dangerous?